For decades, the name Dan Blocker carried a kind of magic. To millions of Americans who grew up watching Bonanza on their television sets every Sunday evening, he was Hoss Cartwright, the big-hearted, barrel-chested, gentle giant who made the Ponderosa Ranch feel like home. But behind the warm smile and the beloved character was a real man, complex and layered, whose life contained chapters that never made it onto the screen. Now, at 66 years old, his son Der Blocker has begun to pull back the curtain, confirming things that fans long suspected, but never had the chance to hear spoken aloud by someone who actually lived it. The story of Dan Blocker doesn't begin in Hollywood. It begins in the dust and heat of DeKalb, Texas, on December 10, 1928, where a baby boy named Bobby Dan Davis Blocker entered the world weighing an astonishing 14 pounds. It was, in every sense, a larger-than-life arrival that seemed to foreshadow everything that would follow. Growing up in the small town of O'Donnell, Texas, young Dan helped his family in their grocery store, hauled grain alongside grown men by the time he was 10, and earned the neighborhood nickname, the Big Un, before he had even reached his teenage years. By age 12, he stood 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. He wasn't just physically imposing, he was genuinely extraordinary. What made Dan Blocker unusual wasn't simply his size. It was the combination of that physical presence with a remarkably tender and thoughtful interior life. He was a reader, a thinker, a man who would go on to earn a master's degree in theater and develop a deep appreciation for literature and philosophy. When his college drama club recruited him simply to move heavy props, no one expected that the big football player would fall in love with the stage. But he did. He changed his major from English to theater, turned down offers to play professional football, and eventually made his way to New York City to pursue a career in acting, landing a role in King Lear on the Broadway stage before Hollywood ever came calling. Then came the Korean War. Dan Blocker traded the stage for military fatigues and served as a combat infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment. He fought on the front lines near Chorwon, North Korea, enduring brutal cold, trench warfare, and relentless enemy fire for nearly 7 months. On one harrowing night, he charged directly into gunfire to pull a wounded fellow soldier to safety, an act of courage that earned him a Purple Heart but left him physically wounded. When he eventually came home, the war had changed him. He became a vocal critic of military violence, an outspoken advocate for peace, and a man who understood, in a deeply personal way, the true cost of conflict. That experience would color everything he did for the rest of his life. His path to Bonanza was gradual. After returning home, marrying his college sweetheart Dolphia Parker, and beginning a family, Dan moved to California to pursue his doctorate at UCLA. Hollywood noticed him almost immediately. His towering frame and natural Southern warmth made him a perfect fit for the Western genre that dominated 1950s television. He began with small appearances on shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and Have Gun, Will Travel, building his craft and his reputation one role at a time. Then, in 1959, he landed the part that would define him, Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza. For 14 seasons, Dan Blocker breathed life into Hoss with a sincerity that couldn't be manufactured. He once described his approach to the character through the words of Stephen Grellet, an 18th-century Quaker missionary who wrote of doing all the good you can in this world. That philosophy wasn't performance. It was genuinely who Dan Blocker was. Hoss wasn't the sharpest of the Cartwright sons, but he loved fiercely, protected loyally, and treated every living creature with decency. Audiences felt that authenticity because it wasn't entirely fictional. Behind the scenes, the bond between Dan and his co-stars was equally genuine. His friendship with Michael Landon and Lorne Greene ran deep and real. He served as best man at Michael Landon's wedding, a small but telling detail that speaks to the kind of man Dan was off camera. Fame found him, but he never chased it and never entirely made peace with it. His son Dirk has spoken about growing up watching his father be recognized absolutely everywhere they went, unable to take a family vacation without crowds forming, unable to enjoy a simple meal in peace. Even a trip to the Yucatan became a public spectacle, with locals calling out Hoss Cartwright wherever the family turned. This discomfort with celebrity was, according to Dirk, far more profound than most people realized. Dan Blocker was not a man who craved the spotlight. He was a man who had stumbled into it and found himself increasingly trapped by it. In 1970, he made a decision that surprised many in the industry. He moved his entire family to Switzerland. He had read about the Swiss Lake Country in National Geographic and been captivated by its beauty and tranquility. When he and Dolphia visited and saw Lakes Como, Maggiore, and Lugano for themselves, they knew. Switzerland became their home. Bonanza aired there in German, which created a language barrier that granted Dan something rare and precious: anonymity. He could walk down a street without being recognized. He could simply exist as a man rather than a symbol. Rumors swirled at the time that financial troubles had driven him abroad. Dan dismissed those claims directly and firmly. Bonanza had made him a wealthy man, and his co-ownership of the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, a natural extension of both his love for hearty food and his connection to the show, added to that prosperity. The move was never about money. It was about sanity, peace, and giving his children a life that resembled normalcy. And yet even from Switzerland, he remained devoted to the show, traveling back regularly to film each season with the same dedication he had always brought to the work. It was during this period of his life that another side of Dan Blocker became fully visible: his political and moral convictions. This is one of the truths that Dirk has confirmed over the years, and it is a significant one. Dan Blocker was not a man who kept his beliefs quietly to himself when injustice was standing in the room. During a filming trip through the American South in the 1960s, the Bonanza cast and crew arrived at a hotel that refused to accommodate their African-American colleagues due to segregationist policies. Dan Blocker didn't hesitate. He announced that if every member of the cast and crew wasn't welcome, then none of them would be staying, and he meant it. The entire group left together. In a 1964 interview, he put his values into plain language. "I hate a bully worse than anything. I'm a big man. I don't like fights. But if I see a 180-pound guy beating on a 130-pound guy, you can damn well bet I'll take care of the big guy in a hurry." That was Dan Blocker, a man for whom size was a responsibility, not a weapon. He was also deeply aware of the contradictions embedded in his own success. He admired teachers enormously and often expressed concern about how poorly they were compensated compared to entertainers. He reflected honestly on his own wealth, once remarking with characteristic self-awareness that he had, in a sense, sold out for money, though he said it with the wry humor of a man who understood the absurdity of celebrity culture without being destroyed by it. He occasionally entertained the idea of returning to teaching, but the face of Haas Cartwright was simply too recognizable for that quieter life to be practical. Then came May 13th, 1972, a date that changed everything for the Blocker family and for the millions of fans who had grown up with Haas as a fixture in their living rooms. What should have been a routine gallbladder surgery turned fatal when Dan suffered a pulmonary embolism, a sudden blood clot, at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood, California. He was 43 years old. The shock that followed was immediate and enormous. His co-stars were devastated. Michael Landon, who had been one of Dan's closest friends for over a decade, was tasked with writing the first episode of the new season in the shadow of that loss. He chose to let Haas's absence speak for itself. No dramatic explanation, no farewell episode, just a silence that said everything words could not. Bonanza never recovered. NBC moved it from its beloved Sunday night slot to Tuesday evenings, where it competed against ABC's popular movie programming. Ratings fell sharply, and after 14 seasons, the network canceled the series in 1973. The show had lost its heart when it lost Dan Blocker, and everyone, cast, crew, and audience, felt it. For Dirk Blocker, growing up in the aftermath of his father's death meant growing up in the long shadow of a legend. He followed his father into acting, most recently known for his role as Detective Michael Hitchcock on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but deliberately chose a different kind of career path. Where Dan had become a star almost against his will, Dirk sought the relative shelter of character acting, work that allowed him to be present in stories without being consumed by celebrity. He has spoken openly about how watching his father's relationship with fame shaped that choice. He saw what the spotlight cost Dan Blocker, and he decided early that he would build his life differently. Now, at 66, Dirk Blocker has confirmed what those who followed his father's career always sensed. that Dan Blocker was a man whose private self was every bit as remarkable as the character he played. His courage wasn't theatrical, it was real, tested in Korea, demonstrated in the American South, and expressed daily in the choices he made about how to treat other people. His warmth wasn't performance. It was the natural overflow of a genuinely good human being. His discomfort with fame wasn't false modesty. It was the honest response of a thoughtful man who understood that celebrity and character are not the same thing. The legend of Haas Cartwright endures because Dan Blocker poured something genuine into him, a philosophy, a set of values, a way of moving through the world that resonated with audiences because it was, at its core, true. And now, through his son's voice, that truth is finally complete.